So what I want to do is say something about everybody's experience and knowledge and understanding in the room. This isn't about, obviously, the title of today is Race, Gender and Children Caught Up in Cycles of Crime, Disproportionality. I'm not coming into the session assuming that there's a lack of awareness, values or commitment from anybody. We know that the way that we're taught, that we're usually acutely aware that disproportionality exists. What the session is about is something a little bit different. It's about how disproportionality is produced, not through dramatic moments of discrimination, but through everyday professional decisions, conversations that are taken and made under pressure within systems that are already quite unequal. So we're going to look particularly, because it's an area of work that we focus on in Shift, at youth justice, because it's one of the clearest places where these dynamics seem to show up, but the learning applies far beyond youth justice. The stance that I'm taking, it's not about individual blame, it's about making the invisible mechanics of the system visible so we can work more deliberately inside them. If at points anything that I'm saying feels uncomfortable or challenging, that's okay. Discomfort usually tells us that we're close to something important. So we've got three aims in this session, and first it's really to deepen our understanding of disproportionality in youth justice, not just the headline figures, but how children actually move through systems and why outcomes harden over time. The second is to explore adultification and gendered experiences, particularly for Black girls, Black and brown girls, and how this is subtly reshaped safeguarding thresholds, risk assessments and professional curiosity. The third is to think systemically about bias, inequality and structural pressure, and how these show up inside ordinary social work pressures when you think about things like assessments, reports, multi-agency meetings and court narratives. So throughout, I'm going to try to keep bringing us back to practice, not what should happen, but what tends to happen and why. So when we talk about disproportionality, we're talking about patterns that repeat across geography, services and time. Black and brown children are overrepresented in youth justice overall. This is based in research. But what's particularly striking is where disproportionality becomes most acute. So that's remand and custody, the sharper end of the system. This tells us something really important, and that's that the system doesn't become more forgiving as children get older or more known to services. It actually becomes less tolerant. So early on, behaviour can be contextualised as family stress, trauma, unmet needs through a variety of different things. But over time, what we see when behaviours continue is that they start to be read very differently by services. So they accrue more meaning. So they become evidence of risk, entrenchment, or in some cases, and I'm sure many of you have heard language like this before, there's a little bit of victim blaming and made out like it's the choice of that young person. Many social workers recognise this moment, the point where a child tips from being concerning to becoming problematic, not because that's the view of ourselves, but that's because that's the language and labelling that is used externally in, again, reports, in meetings, etc. And once that shift happens, it's really, really difficult to reverse. In the service that I work in, this is something that we're constantly challenging, which is why we work with the children that we do. So nationally, the pattern is consistently shown in research. So the Youth Endowment Fund, for example, which highlights the overrepresentation of Black Caribbean and Black African children at multiple points in the youth justice system, particularly at remand and custody. This is why, for one of our practices in Manchester, one of our strategic objectives is to reduce remand and custody for our children, with the focus of it being particularly on Black and brown children. What the Youth Endowment Fund is very clear about is that disproportionality isn't explained by one factor or one decision. It reflects pathways through the system over time. So as we go on, what I'd like you to keep in mind is what changes, not in the child, but what changes in the system's tolerance of the child. It's important also to say that youth justice outcomes don't begin at court, they begin much earlier. So it's in how concerns are framed, how behaviour is interpreted, and how risk and vulnerability are recorded. So we as social workers are often among the first professionals to produce narratives about children that later travel into policing, youth justice and court settings. So when we talk about disproportionality, we're not talking about something that happens after social work. We're talking about something that social work is already shaping, often without being named as such. And the reason I'm kind of talking about social work and youth justice together is because I feel quite often, in my experience and in what I do now, social workers often don't feel like they've got the power, any power in that system, in the youth justice system, and actually you really have. So we need to think about where disproportionality grows. So bringing your professional knowledge into the room, based on what you've seen, not policy, not theory, where do you think disproportionality grows the most? I think it's actually spread. So yes, it's court systems, it's policing, it's remand, it's care placements, it's diversion, and that spread actually matters because it tells us that it's not actually one bad stage. What research consistently shows is that disproportionality accumulates. So each decision doesn't create the inequality on its own, it adds to it. By the time a child reaches court or custody, inequality has already been rehearsed through multiple systems. But another way of putting this really is that risk travels faster. Risk seems to travel faster than protection does. So the Howard League for Penal Reform referred to, this is exactly what the Howard League for Penal Reform referred to when it says disproportionality is amplified at every stage of the youth justice process, from policing through to custody. Their work shows that as children move through systems, discretionary decisions accumulate and earlier narratives increasingly shape later outcomes. Youth justice systems don't just respond to behaviour, they also respond to histories, and it's really important that we remember that. So early contact generates information. Each piece of information shapes the next professional judgment. And over time, as you will know, a narrative forms. That narrative can be self-reinforcing, known to services, non-compliant, escalating risk, or my personal favourite, or bugbear, should I say, risk-taking behaviours. Once a child is located within that narrative, decisions that might otherwise feel disproportionate start to feel reasonable. And this is where social work becomes pivotal. So reports, assessments, professional summaries often act as hinge points. So not because they're inaccurate, but because they're interpreted within systems that are very anxious and risk focused. So we know that the system is stretched. That's no secret. But one of the reasons disproportionality becomes amplified is that systems rely heavily on prior professional accounts. So youth justice services, courts, police often make decisions based on what they already know about a child, and that knowledge is frequently drawn from social work assessments, chronologies and risk summaries. Even when social workers aren't making youth justice decisions directly, you are often shaping the material that those decisions are based in. And this is something that our guides are spending a lot of time with youth justice, and this isn't in relation to social work, but they spend a lot of their time in the system trying to undo the narrative that's already been created around that young person to try and get them fairer trials, fairer sentencing and things like that. This means that how behaviour is contextualised as safeguarding, exploitation, distress or risk has a massive impact on whether a child's diverted, escalated or criminalised. So in the UK, policing reviews, including work such as identifying disproportionality by Avon and I think it was Somerset Police, highlight how data gaps, trust and representation shape who becomes visible into the systems in the first place. This aligns with wider research on structural inequality, which shows that systems under pressure tend to rely more heavily on heuristics and assumptions, particularly around risk and credibility. So it's really important to say explicitly that systems, they just don't start from a neutral position. Structural inequality shapes who is surveilled, who was believed and who was protected long before youth justice involvement. So when systems are under pressure, which I've referred to earlier, high demand, limited resources, political scrutiny, thresholds harden. And we can see that happening in real time as well in other areas. Those hardened thresholds do not fall evenly across our children. Structural inequality shows up most clearly when the system's stressed. That's when discretion tightens and control becomes the default response. Structural inequality doesn't only operate through policy or policing, it operates through judgment under pressure. So we, as social workers, are often required to make rapid assessments in high risk contexts with limited time as well, using limited information within systems that are already anxious. And in those moments, dominant narratives around race, maturity, responsibility can quietly shape decisions around credibility, risk, and protection. So being aware of this doesn't weaken professional judgment, it strengthens it by allowing us as social workers to pause and question how inequality might be shaping the frame around the child. Okay, so this is about moving into adultification. Most people, if not all, probably have heard on this call, probably know what that means already. But it's one of the most significant and least consciously acknowledged dynamics in many spaces. People use the word, but I don't think it's often really thought about in the grander scheme of things or in what that means for the outcomes of particular children. Research shows that Black children are more likely to be perceived as older, more responsible, and less vulnerable than their peers. Their emotions are more likely to be read as anger or intent rather than distress. And what's really concerning is how early this begins. So there's evidence of this that states young Black and brown children are adultified from the age of as young as 5 years old. So the concept of adultification actually originally comes from a study called Girlhood Interrupted, the erasure of Black girls' childhood, which is an American study, and that showed that Black girls as young as 5 were perceived as more adult-like, less innocent, less in need of protection than their white peers. Although that research is US-based, it has been replicated quite a lot and extended in UK contexts, particularly in education, care, and safeguarding systems. Hopefully, you all know who Janine Davis is, but she has championed the research around this in the UK. She has made this a talking point, and she is currently known for her research and leadership on adultification bias. So if you haven't already, just look at some of her papers. Very, very easy to get into, easy to read, easy to understand, and also very, very interesting and concerning. One of the key things I think to acknowledge, and Janine Davis talks about this, is the fact that adultification isn't just about age perception. It's about withdrawal of curiosity. When a child is adultified, we stop asking them, what's happening to you? And start asking, why are you doing this? Or those conversations are had in professional spaces. Why are they doing this? And even when you can see that somebody might be trying to deviate away from asking that question, it kind of appears in the way they might describe the child, the way they might describe the situations that the child has been in. It's easy to see when somebody is doing that or thinking in that way about a child or a young person. The shift from what's happening to you to why you're doing this feels subtle, but fundamentally changes the response from everybody and the intervention that is offered and the support that is offered to that child. The reason this matters in youth justice is because it shifts the threshold at which children are seen as deserving of protection. So when a child is perceived as more mature, more knowing, or more responsible, so we still hear this now, when a young person is being groomed or exploited, using labels and names such as, they're becoming like one of the bosses, they've become a recruiter. That's still victim blaming, that's still adultifying that young person. So as I was saying, when a child is perceived as mature, more knowing and more responsible, safeguarding responses are more likely to fall away and enforcement responses are more likely to step in. So we play a crucial role here because social workers are often the professionals asked to comment on a child's understanding, capacity, or level of insight. These judgments, even when they're well-intentioned, can be taken up by youth justice systems as evidence that a child should be held to account because they should know better. So they should be held to adult-like standards of responsibility. So adultification in care and safeguarding Its adultification is especially pronounced in care and safeguarding contexts. Care systems operate in public regulated spaces. Sometimes they are regulated, other times they're not. Behaviour that would be absorbed privately in families becomes visible, recordable, and people begin to escalate those behaviours. So for Black girls in particular, Black and brown girls in particular, behaviour is more likely to be framed as choice rather than vulnerability. This reframing allows safeguarding responses and responsibilities to fall away, and more punitive responses, to take that place. And we've seen this. I'm thinking about my time in practice and in shift with our guides. We've seen this with girls in education quite a lot as well, particularly in pupil referral units, where they are actually being treated and taught like they should know better. So when their emotions are on show, they're upset or they're distracted, the responses to them are punitive. They're getting suspended. For one young girl was painting hands with glue so she could peel it off. I mean, I used to do that in school as well, but their response to that was to send her home for several days. Yet when we were comparing the response to how the boys were presenting, very, very punitive in the way that they were handled. So many of us as social workers can experience this as tension between relational instincts and the system's demand for control. So adultification becomes often the mechanism that makes escalation feel justified. So for care experienced children, especially Black and brown girls, social work practice sits directly at the boundary between safeguarding and criminalisation. We have to fight harder for these girls, especially when we think about how the youth justice system is built. It is built to respond to boys. It's not built to respond to girls. And then when you throw social graces such as race into that as well and think about adultification, it becomes extremely problematic because the system doesn't know what to do with girls, which is why we are so significant in this space when girls are kind of leaning over into that space, into the youth justice space. So decisions about placement stability, missing responses, behaviour management often determine whether concerns remain within care systems or escalate into youth justice involvement. So we as social workers are frequently navigating competing pressures to safeguard, to manage risk, and to respond to external scrutiny, which I would say we're probably one of the only professions that experiences that. Where adultification is operating, these pressures can tip practice away from protection and towards control, even when the underlying need is vulnerability. And UK research, including work published through White Rose Research Online repository on the adultification of Black girls in state care, shows how adultification operates within child welfare systems, not just in criminal justice. It highlights as well how Black girls are more likely to be viewed as knowing, difficult, or manipulative, which in turn lowers safeguarding responses across the system and increases punitive or controlling interventions. And again, I will say in shift, we work with very, very few girls, but it's glaringly obvious that is happening with them. I want to just say that I just want to ground this next part in practice-based research from Shift's report. So we developed a report called Invisibilised, Girls Caught Up in or at Risk of Crime. And our research drew directly on the experiences of girls, families and practitioners working across social care, youth justice, education and policing, and it mirrors the national patterns that we've just discussed. So I think one of the quotes that you can see from on the slide is that girls describe feeling invisible when being harmed, yet hyper-visible when distressed, angry or non-compliant, caught between neglect and punishment. So it seems that it's more common and more obvious and more accepted in services than people are willing to kind of discuss or admit. What captures this is a bit of a paradox because girls are invisible, like I said, with the quote, when being harmed, but we see them when they're labelled as troublemakers or trouble causing. But actually, what we know is that often that's just signs of distress. That could be signs of distress or stress or pressure, etc. What's important is that our findings, and I've said this, align with wider evidence on cumulative disadvantage. So, including recent work on inequality and youth justice pathways by Van der Brink, which shows how disadvantage becomes embedded through repeated system contact. So, both the national research and Shift's findings point to the same conclusion, that when systems respond relationally and consistently, trajectories can shift. And we are seeing this in Shift with the children that we're working with. Some more information from that was around girls sharing that when somebody stayed curious, when somebody stayed present, and when somebody resisted escalation, that they themselves felt that outcomes change. And there's evidence of that. Arrests reduced, offending trajectories shifted. And that tells us that disproportionality is not inevitable, it's produced, and therefore we can disrupt it. It's disruptable. So this brings us back to social work practice. So we as social workers influence assessments, language, safeguarding, narratives, bail decisions and advocacy, often at moments of high system anxiety. These are leverage points, not heroic ones, but precise ones. So the question isn't, what should social workers do differently? I want to be very explicit here about the role of social workers in the youth justice system. Even when we, as social workers, do not work in youth justice services, we're shaping youth justice outcomes all the time. So we influence how a child is described before first police contact. We influence whether behaviour is framed as safeguarding or offending. We influence how exploitation and coercion are understood. We influence bail and accommodation decisions, and we also influence whether a child is seen as manageable or escalating. Youth justice outcomes are often decided before a child is even reached court. So think about things like the assessments and the reports that youth justice write, the perceptions that they have based on information that they have. And these, like, as I said, these come through everyday judgments and narratives. The difference that we can make is rarely dramatic or immediate. It just lies in slowing escalation, resisting adultification, advocating for that child in that way, keeping vulnerability visible, and holding childhood in the narrative when systems are under pressure and leaning towards that bias, that disproportionality, that adultification. It's not soft, it's skilled, and it's system aware safeguarding work. What we need to think about now is where we have the leverage to slow escalation and to reintroduce curiosity. I just wanted to say that I really wanted to bring youth justice into this space because when I was a practicing social worker, it was almost like we were two completely separate services. I'd have children that were arrested and I'd find out about that through my line manager, not through the person, not through the youth justice officer. I wouldn't know dates, court dates and things like that. Yet we're all meant to be, even though the roles are very different, we're all meant to be trying to achieve the same thing, and that is making the lives better, these children's lives better, helping them to feel safer, etc. And I saw a lot of not helplessness across social work teams, but they're not letting us in. What can I do? But from the role that I'm doing now, I've been able to actually get people through the door, get our teams through the door. And what we have is our guides making real impact in things like pre-sentencing reports in court when children are in court, that are swaying judges' decisions not to send them to custody. You, as social workers, have that power as well. And this is something that I wished I knew when I was practicing. So I really, really wanted to kind of talk about this today and I'm not for 1 minute thinking that everybody in this room is naive and doesn't know that they can do that, but I've come across people that don't. So that's why I really wanted to kind of talk about it today. What I want to do is just return to the central message, and that is that disproportionality in youth justice, it's not inevitable. It's produced through systems, narratives and decisions. And we as social workers sit in all three. And that's why you are so important. And that's why your practice matters. Disproportionality persists, not because social workers aren't trying the hardest to prevent it from happening, but because systems reward speed, certainty, and control. Skilled practice is often about holding space for ambiguity, relational thinking, and childhood, even when the systems that we're working in are anxious. And that work really matters, and what you're doing will really make a difference.